You're listening to This Rhetorical Life, a podcast dedicated to the practice, pedagogy, and public circulation of rhetoric in our lives. Hi all, I'm Carrie Ann Soto, and today I'm introducing our guest host, Cruz Medina, who is an assistant professor of rhetoric and composition at Santa Clara University. In 2015, his book Reclaiming Pochapop, Examining the Rhetoric of Cultural Deficiency, looked at the pop culture responding to anti-Latinx laws passed in Arizona. To me, this kind of work continues to strengthen a stance of hope in the face of continued state repression of people of color in the U.S. His current work with Octavio Pimentel looks at racist discourse circulating through social media in response to non-whites, and it also looks at how people of color compose multimodally for non-academic literacy practices, activism, and storytelling. Speaking of storytelling, I'm so excited to share his interview with Ana Castillo, renowned for her Chicana literature and coining the term Chicanismo. Her work reminds us of the long legacy of Latina resistance in art. I'm so glad Cruz Medina reached out to share his conversation with this important figure. Thanks, Cruz.
Hi, Carrie Ann. So happy to be here. I had the opportunity to sit down and speak with writer Ana Castillo while we were both teaching this summer at the Loaf School of English in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Loaf is a master's in English program from Middlebury College in Vermont. The program in New Mexico is about 25 years old, but the Loaf program has been a who's who's of writers and scholars. Most notably, Robert Frost was associated with the program for decades, with word being even he'd purchased some of the land for the Vermont campus. From within the field of rhetoric and composition, Andrea Lunsford and Adam Banks have taught at Vermont. Cheryl Glenn has been the director at the Santa Fe campus, where Damian Baca also teaches, and I would recommend the Loaf program for any graduating undergraduate students who are going into teaching and want to continue to study English and earn their masters over the course of a few summers from a diverse and prestigious faculty. I was really excited to speak and work this summer with Ana Castillo because, like a lot of us in English, I came to writing through the appreciation of literature, and I'm appreciative of Ana Castillo's work because her writing reflects aspects of Latino experience in the U.S. Admittedly, I didn't come to her work when I was young. Instead, I came to know her work through the Mexican American Studies, or MAS program, that was banned in Tucson while I was a graduate student at the University of Arizona. I focus on this ban in my book Reclaiming Pochapop because I was impressed with the positive impact on students who had graduated from the program. While I was teaching writing at the U of A, I can recall one of my students, Crystal, who had graduated from the Mexican American Studies program, walking out of my class reading Ana Castillo's book, So Far From God. Castillo's writing grapples with complex issues including language, familial roles, ambition and expectations for women, and sexual identity. In addition to So Far From God, Castillo is well known for her book Massacre of the Dreamers, Essays on Chicanismo, in which she coins the term Chicanismo with an X to refer to Chicana feminism. She wrote the Spanish adaptation to This Bridge Called My Back, as well as several novels, books of poetry, and other edited collections. Within rhetoric and composition, my friend and colleague Asia Martinez has drawn on Castillo's work and its attention to the imperialist role of language ideology and assimilation in the U.S. borderlands. Asia's work, like Castillo's, draws attention to aspects of how Latina experience language in the U.S., which is also being studied by Latinos such as Juan Guerra, Stephen Alvarez, Laura Gonzalez, and Sarah Alvarez. As a writer, Ana Castillo's work is the art that identifies subject matter before those of us who are academics and scholars are able to apply lenses or qualify and quantify these rich sites of inquiry. And this is so important because there are still folks doing research on Latinas and Latinos who bring in very little or no Latino scholarship, reaffirming what Jacqueline Jones Royster said in When the First Voice You Hear Is Not Your Own, that we are once again told that Columbus discovered America. In our interview, we discussed topics including transgressive writing, the use of Spanish in the home, reconciling what makes good writing with the misogyny of writers such as Charles Bukowski, having a supportive audience as a writer starting out, cultivating relationships with others through shared art, the stigma of clinical depression, and who receives rehabilitative treatment and who is penalized. We speak about how feminism continues to seek equal rights and why it is so important now for people of color, and the implications of what it means to be a writer in the public eye. Thank you for being with me, Ana.
Well, thank you for the interview.
So, the title of your recent memoir is Black Dove, Mama, Mijo, and Me. I think the Black Dove part comes from a song that your mother sang while you moved out. Is that true? And I think, could you explain what was the subtitle, Mama, Mijo, and Me? Where does that come from?
Okay. The book is a compilation of personal essays and memoir. The earliest essay in the book is called My Mother's Mexico, and it goes back to over 20 years ago. I thought for a very long time that I would like to put together a combination of essays that I was writing and publishing in different places, and that the leading essay would be My Mother's Mexico. But as time has gone on, I think I've become more mother in this life than daughter, so hence the changing of the title. The title, however, does come from my mother and her beautiful singing voice, as I write about in the essay about this. She sang that song as I was leaving my home. I wasn't going very far. I was trying to go to community college, you know, how that goes. First one, you know, who doesn't, elope, but, decides to go and pursue her education. But, for a Mexican and traditional mother, that was like my taking the road to perdition. And that song, Paloma Negra, says that. You've gone off to live this, this nightlife, parrandera. Mama, Mijo, and Me, so it is about my mother, but and her influences on me. It's also about me and my own teenage years in Chicago during that period of time in the late 60s and early 70s. And then, as I mentioned, there's quite a bit of new material about raising a son.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting too was I love that your mother had this really strong willfulness about only speaking Spanish to you in public, right? And I guess at home, was it the same way where she'd only speak in Spanish at home? And then, because I think what sticks out to me about that is I know like friends of mine like Asia Martinez, who I know who cites your work with language. I'm wondering if like your experiences from your mother and her perspectives on language kind of informed how you think about language in some of your work.
Well, I do think quite a bit about language, and I don't know how much of that is exclusively with the bilingualism. My mother, in fact, may she rest in peace, never spoke to me in English, never. Her last words to me what before she died the day she did, which she had a stroke that day on dialysis, was hasta luego, mi amor. I'll see you later, my love. She didn't say that in English. She never spoke to me in English. And what was so funny about that was that she worked for decades in factories outside the home, and so obviously she had to know English to some degree. She also sold Avon, and so she had other things she had to do. She read the Chicago Sun-Times every single day, and yet it was ingrained in me that if I spoke to her in English, she would not understand me, and she would say that, no te entiendo. So then I'd have to speak to her in Spanish. Now everybody knows that that benefited me, would know that, logic would follow that that benefited me, and indeed it did, which is that I became fluent bilingually. My father, who was born and raised in Chicago, was bilingual, but he was born and raised in Chicago and a product of the Chicago public schools, and he spoke to me mostly in English. He spoke to my mother also in Spanish, but he was a storyteller and with a Chicago accent from Little Italy, and so I also listened to the nuances of how English is being spoken, how Spanish is spoken, who's speaking it, who's speaking in either language, or are they using both languages. So I think that being an attentive listener as a child and trying to, like all children, learn from the people around you did make me very aware of language and how it's used. And inadvertently, although neither one knew where I came from as to decide to be a writer, inadvertently they both taught me about storytelling.
I think I've heard you say, too, you didn't start off to be a writer, or maybe you started off as a poet. And in your book, you do mention how, I think it was your tia Flor, who was really like someone who was a great audience for you because she wasn't really judgmental. Do you think that that's really important for like a young writer or a new writer to have sort of that audience in mind who isn't going to be very judgmental of your writing?
I remember Pablo Neruda's memoirs, Recuerdo que he vivido. I haven't read it since it came out in the 70s, but some things stay with me. And I remember him talking about what he considered to be his first poem when he was 8 years old. And then he went to the table where his dad and his stepmother were having an adult discussion, and they looked at it, and then they said, one of them said, who wrote this, or where did you copy this from? And he said that was his first experience with irresponsible literary criticism. And so, as a child, I don't think that we do get, in general, especially children who write and who are introspective, get that kind of respect, if you will, or are paid attention to. I didn't develop that relationship with my aunt until I was a grown woman. She had 5 children to concern herself with, so she wasn't my audience, and I don't know if I actually turned to writing and drawing because of that, because I was like a single child. I had 2 older siblings, but they were several years older and more company to each other and off into the world. So I spent a lot of time by myself, and I think that was my audience, is the books that I was reading, speaking to the books through my writing, as we do as writers. But I started that very young, just a little kid.
After talking about the exchange of roles with an audience of writers and writers as audience, I asked Castillo about the role that her son played in her book. She describes a clarity about her son in her communication with him while he was rediscovering his love for reading and writing. This got me thinking about Castillo's experience as a writer starting out, and how she describes her tia Flor as being an audience for her who was never judgmental about Ana's writing. Similarly, I recall that Kurt Vonnegut said that he always wrote with his sister Allie in mind as his intended audience. So many of us who write and work with young writers are always switching between roles as we provide guidance, and then ourselves transition into the vulnerable position of asking colleagues for feedback as we are writing. So I was curious about the kind of feedback and guidance a celebrated author would offer their child.
Well, I definitely, as an educator who has worked with young people, young adults, since I was a young adult myself, I started teaching when I was 22 in a community college. It's a natural thing for me to impart that with anybody, but especially if, my son had, he'd been through college, he was, he's much more literary than I am. He had a better education than I did. He read Homer when he was 16, and Kierkegaard, and things that I didn't get a chance or an opportunity with the education that I gleaned initially. So it's easy for us to have that conversation. He's a young, educated man, and I'm, partly a college professor and part, writer and public intellectual and thinker. And so I talk that way to everybody, really. But especially in the case of my son in this book, I felt that to a large degree I had lost him intellectually. And I've said this in the book, and I've said this publicly. I don't know what it was. I know that my son spiraled mentally. He was in a depression and a very deep funk. He was very angry. There are many things that I speculate about in the essays that are in this book. The editor at Feminist Press thought it was important to have his voice in it. I agree, and we included an essay that he wrote when he was incarcerated, and some of our exchanges, our email exchanges. What I find very interesting, and this goes back to your question, is how much of our dialogue is book-based. We sort of bounce off books and art and, thinkers and writers, and even when we talk about ourselves in terms of our identity as Chicanos, we're talking about Rudy Anaya or Oscar Zeta Acosta, and then there's Basquiat as an artist and a graffiti artist. So I thought that was interesting, that that's how I relate to life, but that my son also was able to do that.
One of the authors you mentioned as sort of being one that your son found interesting and that you found yourself reading and talking to him about, I think, was Charles Bukowski, who is an interesting figure because he sort of thought of this sort of something misogynist writer, right? And so this is very interesting, knowing that you are one of these people who came up in the beginning of Chicana feminist sort of theory and things. So how was that sort of negotiating, sort of talking about Bukowski maybe as a writer as opposed to maybe some of the negative representations that he was putting out in his writing?
Well, what I'll say about writing is that good writing is good writing. The subject matter aside, and I have enjoyed his stories. I personally feel perhaps he's a better poet than his prose. I discovered Bukowski maybe mid-'80s. I don't know if, I think he may have been still alive, I'm not sure. He was very hot in Paris. I got to a conference in Paris. I think that's actually, the French are always the first ones to go to the transgressive literature. So all that aside, that was cool for me because I could read his poetry, and I have read very few men who are not a little bit misogynist. And a lot of white people who are not a little bit ignorant about race and class. And, who did I grow up reading or as a self-taught writer? D.H. Lawrence, Quetzalcoatl book, or Hemingway talking about Spain. These are white privileged men. So Bukowski, who's Bukowski? Another white man. But that doesn't take away from my appreciation of how he handles language. Now, it was fun for me at that moment, which I did need a little levity with my son's near tragic spiraling and then ended up incarcerated for 2 years, was that when he asked for the books on Bukowski, I decided, well, I'll read the prose. I've read the poetry. It's cool. He's reading the poetry, and I like it. We can talk about that. Was that... as I said, when good literature, good writing is good writing. And when you read good writing and you're a writer, just like when you're a painter or a musician and you hear something that speaks to your ear or to your eyes, you want to go home and do that. You want to try it. You get inspired. And I got inspired, and I decided to experiment with transgressive literature. What happened, consequently, and very quickly, was I wrote the novel Give It To Me. And I wrote it in maybe 2 months. So, which I wrote it, one, to riff off of this style, to see what would Ana Castillo write if she was going to write a transgressive, if she was going to write a transgressive piece of fun fiction. Then it also gave me a good laugh, because on top of the fact that my heart was broken about my son's, where he was, and certainly never where I expected him to be, and what had happened to him mentally, which I also was heartbroken over, I was working on the updated revision of Massacre of the Dreamers, which is, if anyone has looked at the book, it's pretty dense and pretty serious, so I needed a little bit of levity, and that's what actually came out of going back to Bukowski.
Times, and I don't know if I've done a good job of sort of asking the question, sort of maybe to tell a little bit about sort of your son's situation with incarceration, because I think it really brings up these issues that have been coming up with the over-policing of young Black and brown and Latino men. So, and at the same time, this question of mental illness that you're sort of raising, and sort of how we tend to maybe deal with mental illness through sort of punishment as opposed to actually trying to, help these youth, right? So,
well, you're using the term mental illness, which has a stigma in our society, and certainly has a stigma for our culture, which is anybody who goes see a therapist, is loco, and if you're loco, you're banished. My son has never been diagnosed with anything. My observations are, as a mother and someone who knew him, saw him when he was despondent and when he was depressed. We're beginning to look at clinical depression and accept it in our society in general at this time as something that everybody almost in this crazy world that we live in at some point in their lives goes through this clinical depression. Clinical meaning that it's almost out of control. You can't function maybe, or it's hard to function, or you're in a very dark place. And so I saw that in him. Now the other thing I saw in him, which is social and which is addresses your question right now. He was, from 12 years old on, he was growing up in Chicago, in the inner city of Chicago, not out in a nice suburb someplace where people like to say they're in Chicago, but they're really somewhere else in a nice little cul-de-sac. We were in one of the harshest neighborhoods in Chicago. It was what I had, which was affordable, but it's difficult to be in any city or town in this country right now without all the mixture of things that we're aware of that can be happening. There's a lot of drug availability. There's gangbangers for sure from here throughout the world, from here to Russia, let's just put it that way. So he, as a young man, when he leaves home, the house, the nice little apartment that we had with all its conveniences and his room and his own bathroom, he leaves and he is confronted by all of these elements. There's, as I said, there's drug pushers, there's, gangbangers, and there's, prostitution that's real evident, happening like right in the back alley, people selling drugs, could happen anywhere. But also there's uniformed police, and they're at the train station, but they're not stopping everybody. Who they were stopping were the young people, and they were young people of color. I saw it myself. I saw them let me walk by or go across the turntable, coming back from teaching my class at night, 10 o'clock at night, but they'd pull over young women and young men of color, teenagers. My son was one of them. And so what begins to happen is, despite the fact that he does have a mother who has educated him, and he has privilege for education and for travel and things like that, how he is viewed in the eyes of this environment is as a potential menace or a potential recruit, or somehow or other suspect. He might be an immigrant, undocumented, all these things. So what young people start to do is they start to rebel, as they do everywhere. And he also began to get that chip on his shoulder, and you start to, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You start to act tough. You start to build a hard shell. You start to become aggressive, or at least I've seen this with these young people. They become aggressive with other people, other young people, and and so on. And so that's what I address in the book, from a personal level. On a social level, we have a multi-billion-dollar incarceration, mass incarceration industry. So a lot of people make a lot of money on that. Where I take also personal offenses, who gets sent to rehab and who does not. At the time of my son's arrest, we had 2 Illinois governors in federal prison. Now, when they come out, I don't think it's going to be difficult for them to find housing. I don't think it's going to be difficult for them to find employment and to support their families and the lifestyles that they enjoyed in the past. But if the majority that are going to prison are people of color, or people who are already marginalized by society because of their class background or what have you, or lack of education, and they come out and they can't find a place to live, or they can't provide for their young children or be reunited with their families, or and this has happened to my son and is happening to him today as we speak, where he is eligible, he has a college education, and he's eligible, and he's been clean, and he had that felony was an isolated incident in the sense that he had no record before that, nothing since then. He was let off probation early. Nevertheless, because of our laws, he has been turned down for numerous positions for which he's qualified, because of the fact that the law permits you not to hire somebody.
Yeah, you have to check out that box and
they do a background check, and even though he has numerous times been offered a job or liked it in an interview and so on, they'll tell them we can't do it.
Ana Castillo's writing is particularly salient and endures because her experiences resonate so much with what is currently happening. In her 1993 novel, So Far From God, Castillo was challenging readers' assumptions about sexuality. In her novel, strong female characters fall in love and have relationships with both men and women before there was real widespread support for issues such as marriage equality. Castillo grew up in Chicago during the Black Power movement, and she comments on her understanding of being a woman of color in schools that lacked resources. With the increase in charter and private schools, education continues to fail young people of color through systemic forms of segregation that leave these communities with little hope or options of achieving their American dream. In our historical moment, the Black Lives Matter movement asks for the deferred dream of life and the pursuit of happiness. At the same time, when there are murders such as the mass shooting at Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, we see how these struggles for equality continue in the face of individuals indicative of communities who resist social equality and inclusivity. In the context of all these events weighing so heavily on those of us working to provoke critical consciousness, staying woke, and advocating for social justice, I asked Ana Castillo, what do you think of the fact that there is an extreme need for social movements that parallel those that you grew up with?
Yes, well, we don't live in a democracy, and misogyny, patriarchy, I'll throw all the terms, the usual suspects out there. Feminism responds not just to women's rights, but to human rights. I think Audre Lorde said if, Black women don't have equal rights. Nobody has them. We have to think about the people that we have marginalized and disenfranchised most. And everybody in society at some point or another is. So it's a fallacy to think that we have a democracy and that everybody has the same opportunity. But in terms of patriarchy, women for eons have been kept in a secondary place. In terms of race issues in this country, which is only over 200 years old, but if we include the Americas, we're talking about the conquest of Mexico and Peru and so on. So it's over a half a millennium ago here of colonialism here. If we talk about other places in the world, it's been going on for a very, very long time. So 20, 30 years is just a drop in the bucket as far as some of the things that we are addressing. We have made enough progress to say it was needed, and lives have been lost, and lives have been dedicated to these issues. But of course, it's not a surprise to me to think that today we still look at a woman who looks like me and assume that I'm not the professor in the room, but maybe the cleaning lady. It's a natural assumption. We go, young and older people of color walk into a nice store, and before you know it, the security is following you around. This racial profiling not only went on for a long time before, of course it's still going on, and it's going to be a very long time before we see a little more changes. But I don't see it happening, not in my lifetime, and I don't think even in my granddaughter's lifetime.
You're saying so much of this, what's happening in your life or happening in your son's life very much resonates with a lot of these things happening, and that does go back to this idea of sort of the personal being the political. And so I think maybe I'm interested too in thinking about how you've addressed sort of this idea of sort of needing to maybe walk the line between like this public, how you're viewed sort of as this public intellectual and writer versus maybe maintaining this private life. And I think that's something that maybe a lot of people are thinking about now in terms of like social media. We don't see ourselves, we blur that line often, but I feel like how did you come to this idea that you feel like you wanted to make sure to maintain, your private life in such a way that it wasn't, on display with you as the public writer as well?
For a long time, and it was also my mother's wish, I kept my family and my own relationships out of the public eye, because while I may have signed up to be a public person when I started to publish, and the minute you publish something, it belongs to the public. So it's not as if I thought, I'm going to be a famous writer. It's just the fact that I went to do some readings, poetry, reading political poetry, and then I put it out, and my name is there. And so, you go to conferences or you begin to be a speaker. And so all of that, whether it's in your town, in your hometown, or if it's an international forum, makes you a public person. But my family and the people that had personal relationships with me didn't sign up for that. So out of respect for the people around me, I also could not address a lot of the things that I was experiencing on a personal level. Most recently, with the material that I have written about as a mother and my son's life, and my son is fully on board with telling the story publicly, came from the fact that this is a major problem that we have in our society, and it addresses all of those things. It addresses the mass incarceration, the fallacy of the war on drugs from the Reagan era since the 1980s, how our poor communities and communities of color have been invaded by drugs, and all the multitude of things that happen to our young people generation after generation. My son and I felt it really important to share this story, not only for our own personal healing, but also in a way to open up that communication for other people. I think people have an idea that when you're successful at what you do, in my case, publishing books, that you're living this wonderful, glamorous, carefree life. And as we know, when we read these, magazines or about celebrities, and we say, oh, look what's going on in their life, we see that nobody's exempt from the social ills. And it's important for me as a person who cares about all of these issues that we've talked about, for people to understand that I'm not talking from an ivory tower or from some observational space, but that I'm part of that.
Thank you so much, Ana Castillo, for being here, and thank you.
Well, I appreciate it.
Co-executive producers of This Rhetorical Life are Ben Kubrick and Carrie Ann Soto, with additional production from Andre Habe.